Remember the smell of your childhood bedroom? The way the heavy silence of the night felt like a warm blanket that promised you were safe from the world outside? It was a hallucination. The world never actually stopped being a predatory machine. You just had someone else to absorb the blows for you. But for one man in 161 AD, there was no shield. At 4 a.m., while the rest of Rome lay in a wine-soaked, heavy stupor, Marcus Aurelius sat alone. A single oil lamp flickered on a scarred cedar table. The dim yellow light hit the deep, permanent grooves in his forehead. He wasn't praying. He was preparing for a cold-blooded war against his own biology. Most people today look at his writings and see a gentle, poetic guide to a better life. But that is a comforting myth sold to the weak. The reality is that these pages were a desperate psychological defense mechanism. He was the most powerful man on the planet, and that made him the most hunted animal in existence. Power is not a gift. It is a parasite that eats the soul from the inside out, and Marcus knew the only way to survive was to turn his mind into a fortress of cold, calculated logic. The truth is that he wasn't writing for us. He was writing to keep himself from becoming the very monsters he had to execute. Look around you at the digital chaos of the modern world. It is loud, it is fake, and it is meticulously designed to keep you vibrating with a shallow, useless anxiety. Subscribe to this channel right now. Let this be your quiet sanctuary of truth in a landscape of manufactured noise. Back in that tent, the air smelled of burnt wick and damp earth. Marcus dipped his reed pen into the ink. His fingers were calloused from the hilt of a gladius, not from turning pages in a library. He wrote about the shortness of life not because he was being deep, but because he had seen men decapitated for a few bags of copper coins. He understood the brutal Machiavellian mathematics of the Roman state. If the emperor showed a single crack of emotional fear, the legions would smell the blood in the water. The Germanic tribes across the river were not waiting for a philosophical debate. They were waiting for a single moment of hesitation to bridge the frontier and turn the empire into a slaughterhouse. This 4 a.m. ritual was the most important military operation in the history of the Mediterranean. It was the daily maintenance of the ultimate weapon, the emperor's iron will.
The world had ever seen.
Without it, the grain ships from Egypt would stop. The marble temples would be stripped. The entire Pax Romana was held together by the ink on those scraps of papyrus. But here is the dark reality that most historians are too afraid to mention. While Marcus was mastering his pulse, the very system he was trying to save was already rotting from the roots up. The escalation had begun. It started with a single disciplined thought in the dark and would eventually lead to the total systemic collapse of the greatest superpower the world had ever seen. The ink was barely dry on his page when the first reports of the Great Plague arrived. A microscopic killer was hitching a ride on the backs of returning soldiers. It didn't care about stoic virtue. It didn't care about the divine right of kings. It only cared about lungs and blood. Marcus looked at the map of his empire, the red line stretching from the fog of Britain to the heat of the Persian Gulf, and he realized that no amount of mental discipline could stop a virus. The power he wielded was absolute, yet it was completely useless against the invisible. This is the paradox of high-level command. You can control the legions, you can control the Senate, but you can never truly control the wind. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The shadow of the lamp stretched across the floor like a dark omen. He wasn't just an emperor anymore. He was a man trying to hold back the tide with a wooden bucket. The psychological pressure was enough to snap a normal human spine. Every decision he made meant thousands lived or thousands died in the freezing mud of the borderlands. There was no room for feeling. There was only the brutal necessity of survival. The state demanded a machine, so he killed the man inside him to give them one. He looked at the flickering flame and realized the fire was going out. Not just the lamp, but the world he knew. And he was the only one awake to see it. Look at your own hands for a second. You probably see clean skin, maybe a slight tremor from too much caffeine, or the blue light of your screen reflecting off your nails. For Marcus Aurelius, in the winter of 166, his hands were stained with the permanent black soot of the midnight oil and the faint copper smell of old blood that never seemed to leave the palace air. The plague had moved past the stage of a mere medical emergency. It was now a structural failure of reality. Visualize the ports of Ostia. Usually, they are the lungs of the world, breathing in grain, silk, and spice. Now the ships drifted in like ghosts, their sails ragged and gray, manned by skeletons or men so delirious they mistook the horizon for a wall of fire. The crates of pepper sat rotting on the docks because the men paid to carry them were currently being thrown into mass pits outside the city walls. This is how a superpower dies. It doesn't always end with a climactic battle or a dramatic speech on the Senate floor. It ends with the silence of an empty marketplace. It ends with the sound of a single gold coin hitting the marble floor and nobody being left to pick it up. You might think your modern world is insulated by fiber optic cables and sterile hospitals, but the mechanism of collapse remains identical. When the labor force stops breathing, the gears of the world grind into dust. Marcus sat in his tent on the Danubian frontier, the cold wind whipping the heavy leather flaps, and he watched the tally marks on his ledger. The numbers were screaming. To keep the Germanic tribes from crossing the frozen river, he needed soldiers. To get soldiers, he needed silver. To get silver, he needed taxpayers. But the taxpayers were currently turning black and liquefying in their beds across the Mediterranean. The math was no longer adding up. The empire was a giant, shimmering machine that had suddenly run out of oil. He didn't panic. Panic is for those who still believe they can negotiate with the inevitable. Instead, he did something that would make a modern politician's blood run cold. He walked into the imperial treasury, looked at the crown jewels, the silk robes, the golden statues of his ancestors, and he ordered a garage sale. Imagine the scene. The most powerful man on earth, standing in the middle of a public square, auctioning off his own furniture to pay for a war that everyone knew was already lost. The gravelly voice of the auctioneer echoing through the forum, selling the emperor's crystal goblets to the very merchants who were terrified they wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. This wasn't an act of charity. It was a desperate, calculated amputation. He was cutting off the gold to save the iron. Look around you and ask yourself what you would be willing to sell if the lights went out tomorrow. Your car, your house, your very identity? Marcus sold the memory of his family's wealth just to buy another week of survival for a border wall. The psychological toll was a slow-motion car crash. He was writing his meditations not as a book for you to read in a cozy coffee shop, but as a mental tourniquet. He was bleeding out, and the words were the only thing stopping the hemorrhage. Every night, he stared at the map by the light of a single flickering candle. He saw the red lines of the empire and realized they weren't borders anymore. They were scars. The barbarians on the other side of the river weren't just invaders. They were a biological pressure, sensing the weakness of a dying organism. They could smell the rot from miles away. The Romans used to be gods in iron. Now they were just sick men hiding behind crumbling stones. The escalation had reached its terminal phase. It started with a cough in a dark tent in Mesopotamia and had grown into a systemic paralysis. The temples were full of people praying to gods who had clearly left the building. The smoke from the funeral pyres was so thick it blotted out the sun in Rome for days at a time, creating a false permanent twilight. Marcus looked at his reflection in a polished bronze shield. He saw a man who had mastered his mind but lost his world. He realized that the ultimate test of a leader isn't how he handles success, but how he presides over a funeral. He wasn't just the emperor of Rome. He was the chief mourner of a civilization. The weight of every dead child, every abandoned farm, and every broken legionary rested directly on the bridge of his nose. And yet, he picked up the pen. He wrote, not about the pain, but about the duty. He understood the dark secret of high-level power. When the system collapses, the only thing left is the character of the man standing at the center of the ruins. The marble would eventually fall. The coins would be melted down. The very language he spoke would become a dead relic. But the discipline, the refusal to break, that was the only thing the plague couldn't touch. He was fighting a war on two fronts. One against the Marcomanni on the river, and one against the void inside his own heart. The void was winning. Every morning the report was the same. More deaths, fewer recruits, smaller harvests. The Roman currency, the denarius, was being debased, the silver replaced with cheap copper, a physical manifestation of a lie. The empire was literally becoming less valuable with every passing hour. He saw the inflation, he saw the supply chain breaking, and he saw the fear in the eyes of his generals. They wanted a miracle. He gave them a syllabus on how to suffer with dignity. You see, the reality of a collapsing system is that there is no back to normal. There is only the new, harsher reality that you must learn to navigate. Marcus didn't promise a cure. He didn't promise a victory. He only promised that he would stay awake until the very end. The escalation was complete. The world had shifted from the golden age of the Antonines into a brutal, dark struggle for basic existence. The ink on his papyrus was the only thing that wasn't rotting. It was the only thing that felt solid in a world made of liquid fear. He looked out at the frozen Danube, the ice cracking like the sound of a bone breaking, and he knew the winter was never going to end. The Great Plague wasn't just a disease. It was the universe reminding the emperor that he was nothing more than a temporary arrangement of atoms. His crown was a circle of gold that felt like a circle of lead. He adjusted his cloak, the purple dye faded and smelling of damp wool, and stepped out into the freezing mud. The man was dead. Long live the machine. But even machines break when the cold gets deep enough. The systemic collapse was no longer a threat. It was the atmosphere. And as he walked through the camp, passing rows of shivering men who looked at him with hollow eyes, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. He wasn't the doctor of the empire, he was its hospice nurse. The Great Plague had unmasked the fragile theater of civilization, revealing the raw, hungry chaos beneath. Look at the people in your life today. If the grocery stores were empty for a week, how long until the masks slip? Marcus knew the answer. It was written in the smoke of 1,000 pyres. The fire was growing, and he was the only one left with a bucket, standing in the middle of an ocean of gasoline. The tension was no longer about winning. It was about how you choose to fall. He took a deep breath of the cold, diseased air, felt the itch in the back of his throat, and made his choice. He would not hide. He would not flee to a villa in the hills. He would stand in the mud until the mud claimed him. This is the ultimate escalation, from a disciplined thought to a global collapse, ending in a single solitary act of defiance against the inevitable. The ink was dry, the map was burning, the end was no longer coming. It was here, and it looked exactly like the man in the mirror. Every morning, a low-level clerk in the Roman administration would dip a wooden ladle into a heavy sack of grain. 1 scoop, 2 scoops. The sound of dried barley hitting a bronze bowl was the heartbeat of the empire's survival. It was a micro-habit of logistics, a rhythmic assurance that the machine was still breathing. But that morning, the grain didn't sound like barley. It sounded like gravel. The clerk looked down and saw the weevils, a seething black carpet eating the caloric foundation of the world from the inside out. This wasn't just a bad batch of food. It was the first domino in a global cascade of failure. The ships from Egypt weren't coming. The sailors were either feeding the fish or coughing up their lungs in the ports of Alexandria. Look at the logistics chain in your own life. The thin plastic cards in your wallet, the digital numbers on your screen, the flickering lights of your refrigerator. It's a delicate, interconnected web of miracles that we've mistaken for a natural law. That sense of security is a beautiful trap designed to keep you quiet while the foundation rots. The laws of nature are far more savage than our supply chain diagrams. When the grain stopped moving, the legions stopped marching. When the legions stopped marching, the borders turned into sieves. The Germanic tribes didn't even need to fight. They just walked through the gaps left by men too weak to hold a spear. The collapse wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing rust. It started with a ladle and ended with a city of marble being used as a limestone kiln. You are currently living in the peak of a similar cycle, a golden hour that feels eternal. But the shadows are stretching across the pavement. The ink on the map is already starting to blur. You need to see the cracks before the ceiling falls. Subscribe to prepare your mind for what's coming next year, because the luxury of ignorance is a debt that always comes due with interest. Marcus saw it. He watched the silver content of the Roman denarius drop until the coins felt like toy money, light and worthless in the palm of a calloused hand. The physical currency of the world was evaporating, replaced by a desperate, feverish barter for the last scraps of dignity. He stood in the marketplace of a dying city, and watched a woman trade a silk dress for a handful of salted fish. The aesthetics of power were being stripped away, revealing the jagged skeletal structure of a species that had forgotten how to hunt. The plague had turned the bustling heart of Rome into a silent, sun-bleached tomb. You can hear the silence growing today if you listen closely enough between the pings of your notifications. It's the sound of a system that has grown too complex to sustain its own weight. The supply lines are straining under the pressure of 1,000 invisible fractures. Marcus didn't try to fix the grain ships anymore. He knew the sea was closed. He didn't try to recruit more men. He knew the villages were empty. Instead, he sat in his tent and wrote. His pen was a needle, and he was trying to sew his soul together before the fabric tore completely. The individual is the only thing that survives a systemic collapse. The institutions are the first to burn, followed by the crowds, and finally, the memory of what was once considered normal. He looked at his hands. They were stained with ink and the gray dust of the camp. He wasn't an emperor, he was a survivor of his own success. The empire had become a cage, and the plague was the only thing that knew how to unlock the door. The escalation was complete. From a grain of barley to a continent of ghosts. The theater was over, and the lights were going out one by one across the face of the known world. The only thing left was the cold, hard ground, and the truth that no one wanted to hear. The end isn't a destination. It's a process. And it has already begun. Look around you. The cracks aren't just in the history books. They are in the pavement under your feet. Marcus Aurelius died in the mud of Vindobona, but the Roman Empire had died long before his heart stopped beating. It died when the first clerk realized the grain was gone and decided to lie about it. It died when the silver became tin. It died when the people preferred a comfortable lie to a lethal truth. We are repeating the script with better technology. The fire is the same, the smoke is just a different color. The man in the mirror isn't a citizen anymore. He's a ghost waiting for the wind to pick up. He closed his eyes, the smell of damp wool and vinegar filling his nostrils. The empire was gone. The machine was broken. Only the man remained, standing in the freezing mud, waiting for the silence to become absolute. The torch in Marcus's tent sputtered, casting long, shivering shadows against the canvas walls, shadows that looked less like men and more like the grasping fingers of a debt that had finally come due. He reached for his cup, but the wine was bitter, cut with the metallic tang of a dying civilization. This is how power actually ends. Not with a grand cinematic battle, but with the quiet, agonizing failure of 1,000 small things. A bridge in Gaul collapses because the surveyor took a bribe. A shipment of grain rots in an Egyptian harbor because the harbor master has no men left to unload it. A coin that used to be pure silver now looks dull and gray, a physical manifestation of a lie that everyone agreed to believe until they couldn't. You see the same thing today when you look at a city skyline. Those shimmering glass towers aren't monuments to progress. They are vertical debts, held together by the frantic clicking of keyboards and the desperate hope that the lights stay on for just one more hour. The reality of power is that it is a parasite that eventually kills its host. Marcus understood this in his final moments. The cold of the Danube seeped into his bones, reminding him that nature doesn't care about titles or empires. The frost on the tent flap was more real than the Senate, more permanent than the legions, and far more honest than any law he had ever signed. The escalation didn't stop in the mud of the 2nd century. It merely went underground, waiting for a more efficient vehicle. We are that vehicle. Think about the phone in your pocket, that sleek slab of glass and rare earth minerals. It is the modern grain ship, the modern legion, and the modern circus all rolled into one. It creates a feedback loop of false security, making you believe that because you can see the world, you can control it. But try to eat a digital image. Try to use a social media profile to stop a supply chain from snapping like a dry twig. The complexity we have built is so vast that no single person understands how it works anymore, which means no one knows how to fix it when the gears start grinding against each other. We have built a cathedral of glass, and we are currently throwing stones at the walls while wondering why the ceiling is cracking. The elites don't care because they have already built their lifeboats, and you aren't on the list. They watch the metrics of collapse with the same detached curiosity that a biologist watches a petri dish. They see your anxiety, your debt, and your frantic search for meaning, and they turn it into a data point to be sold. It feels like a nightmare you can't wake up from, doesn't it? You mention these cracks in the foundation to your neighbors, your colleagues, even your family, and they look at you with a mixture of pity and fear. They want to believe the machine is eternal because the alternative is a silence they aren't prepared to hear. No one will believe you when you tell them the grain is gone while the grocery stores are still artificially lit. And no one will believe the empire is falling while the screens are still bright. Subscribe to find others who do, because when the signal finally cuts out, the only thing that will matter is who else is standing in the dark with their eyes open. We are looking for the ones who can see the gray dust on their hands before the building actually falls. Go ahead, look at the clock on your wall. Every tick is a brick falling from the facade. You think you are watching a documentary, a bit of entertainment to pass the time before you go back to your structured, predictable life. That's the most delicious part of the joke. You are the protagonist of a tragedy you haven't read yet. We've watched this play out a dozen times before, from the ruins of Ur to the marble dust of Rome, and the ending is always the same. We provide the bread, we provide the circuses, and we provide the digital distractions that keep you occupied, while we move the last of the real assets behind the curtain. You are not a citizen. You are not a rebel. You are simply the fuel for the final fire, and you're so terrified of the cold that you'll thank us for the warmth as the house burns down around you. Take a good look at the world outside your window tonight. It's the last time it will ever look that stable. The theater is empty. The actors have already left through the back door, and we're just waiting for you to realize that the applause you hear is actually the sound of the walls caving in. Sleep well, if you can. Look closely at the thumb you are using to scroll right now. There is a faint rhythmic tremor in the muscle, a physical echo of a nervous system that has been hijacked by a frequency it was never meant to tune into. You think you are browsing, but you are being harvested. Every swipe is a heartbeat of data, a tiny drop of blood fed into a central processor that knows your fears better than your own mother does. This isn't just a device in your hand, it is a digital tether, a sophisticated shackle that you pay for every single month with the currency of your own finite time. The transition from a free citizen to a categorized asset didn't happen with a grand proclamation or a military coup. It happened in the quiet glow of bedroom lamps at 3 in the morning when you traded your privacy for a moment of distraction. The escalation moves faster than the human eye can track. It starts with a tailored advertisement and ends with the total liquidation of your personal sovereignty. While you're worrying about the price of eggs or the latest manufactured outrage on your feed, the real architects are moving the pieces across a board you can't even see. They are rerouting the flow of actual resources, water rights, arable land, rare earth minerals, into private vaults that sit beneath mountains you aren't allowed to hike. The world you think you live in is a low-resolution simulation designed to keep your heart rate steady while the foundations are stripped for parts. You see a bank balance on a screen and believe it represents value, but in the halls of power, that number is just a line of code that can be deleted the moment you become a liability to the narrative. The truth is that the social contract was torn up decades ago, and what you're holding now are just the confetti pieces. We have watched you navigate the labyrinth we built, fascinated by how easily you confuse the walls for the horizon. You are caught in a cycle of manufactured crises and temporary reliefs, a perpetual motion machine fueled by your own anxiety. I am leaving breadcrumbs of truth for those who have finally realized the bread they've been fed is made of sawdust. Subscribe to follow the trail before the wind of the next great reset blows it away entirely. Most people will keep walking in circles, terrified of the woods, but a few will understand that the trail leads back to the only thing that was ever real, the power you let us take from you. It is a beautiful trap, isn't it? A gilded cage where the bars are made of light and the lock is your own desire to belong. You stare into the black mirror of your device, looking for a reflection of a self that no longer exists outside of our algorithms. We have mapped every impulse, every doubt, and every desperate hope you possess, turning your very humanity into a predictable trajectory. You think you are the audience, sitting safely in the dark, watching a story unfold about the collapse of a distant system. But look around. The seats are bolted to the floor, the exits are welded shut, and the smoke you smell isn't a special effect. We finished the performance, and now we're just waiting for the lights to go out so we can